J.R. Rahn, CEO of MindMed, returns to talk about his company, latest updates, and the space of biotech. J.R., welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me back, David.
We've got some exciting news to share with current shareholders and future shareholders of your company, but we'll get into that in just a minute. We're going to leave the audience hanging for just a few minutes. Let's talk about your stock. So, look, I'm looking at we'll put up a chart here. I'm looking at your company's stock, and the share price doubled in late April, and then it came back down. But what happened that day? JR, what was that? What was that spike?
Well, I mean, that spike you're looking at is history in the making right there. We listed LSD on the NASDAQ, right?
Nice.
I think if you told me that when I was going through college, or if you even said that to me 5 years ago, I don't think it would have been possible. And so I think there's a lot of excitement around our NASDAQ listing, and I still think there is a ton of excitement around what this, having this listing enables us as a company to become. So yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of interest, and we'll continue pushing forward with that interest.
MMED. Yeah, exactly. So, JR, tell us about the sector as a whole for investors who want to come into the space. Roughly how many companies are currently doing something similar to what you're doing in the psychedelic LSD pharmaceutical space? What's the rough market cap of the entire sector, would you say?
I've lost track on the amount of companies that listed right after us. I mean, I think there's a lot of these companies that, saw the great opportunity that MindMed was working on and tried to sort of in many ways emulate what we're doing. Some of that's real and some of that's not so real. I think there's a clear leadership pack forming in companies like MindMed, Compass, Atai, that are all seeking NASDAQ listings. And that's really where the real war to solve mental health is, I think, going to be fought. I don't think it's necessarily with some of these smaller companies at this point. The interesting thing is that I think there will be a flight to quality, right? So some of these companies that were able to put together a pitch and a business idea, I don't necessarily believe that they're going to be able to continue to be funded. Because a lot of times there's not much there. We've built an incredible IP portfolio, clinical trial pipeline over the last year and a half that really sets us up as a leader in this industry.
I like to comment on your share price once more. The day of your listing, again, it went up a huge amount, 80 to 100%. I found this post on WallStreetBets. You and I were talking about your investor base. This is a Reddit post on WallStreetBets, the very popular finance subreddit group. Millions of followers. If you haven't checked them out already, it's called r/WallStreetBets. They were famous for the GME and AMC squeeze earlier this year. Now, this is a post made on April 24th, just a few days before your listing. MindMed to be listed on NASDAQ. Time for a trip to the moon. As of today, it's got 9.2K, so 9,000 upvotes, 2.7K comments. And it's a pretty long post. We'll post it on the screen and we'll scroll down. Few reasons I invested, the poster wrote. To get in before NASDAQ listing, Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful, is invested. NASDAQ listing allows more money to flow in. Number 6, I like the stock. It's kind of a meme phrase these days. First of all, did you make this post?
I did not. I'm
teasing.
I was surprised when one of my friends from college actually sent me some of these posts from Reddit, and it was a bit in shock. I was like, wow, this is very serious, right? There's a lot of people that are very much interested in MindMed and our mission, and so I think that's extremely powerful. I think this is the voice of people who have been sitting through COVID-19, who have been struggling with mental illness and addiction for a number of years. And people are putting their money where their mouth is. And I think that's actually a really great thing. And ultimately, David, Reddit has its reputation, and so does WallStreetBets, but people make markets. And I'm really glad we have the people behind us on our mission to solve mental illness and addiction.
I think it's not just the fact that you have pharmaceutical applications for your medicine. It's also the fact that I think a lot of these younger investors, they're rooting for sort of the underdog, so to speak. The underdog being the drug producer who's, prior to a few regulatory changes in recent days, have always been oppressed by government. No drugs, no LSD. You get fined, you get put in jail, whatnot. And people have been, people have been rooting for that player. Listen to this. Listen to the opening line here of this post. MindMed is a psychedelic medicine biotech company that studies how shrooms, LSD, and even MDMA and DMT can help treat depression. Honestly, I already confirmed their studies to be true in college. I think people just like what you do. And so there's a lot of younger people who are rooting for not just your mission, but what you represent, is my interpretation of this.
Yeah, David, I don't actually think that it's entirely younger people that are on a lot of these platforms.
Okay.
I think there's a very diverse group. I've actually read through some of the comments now, and I think it's important as a CEO to really understand who you serve, right? Yeah. Like that's my job. We have shareholders that support us and empower us to do good work for society, and also ideally make them some money in the process, right? And so I think that Reddit has really sort of changed that game around being conscious of who you serve. And so ultimately, there's going to be larger institutions that come in and play MindMed in the future. But at the end of the day, both as a CEO, I serve our shareholders, but I also serve the market that we're seeking to address, which are 40% of the United States is suffering from a mental illness or addiction at the moment. I serve them. And so I think having a stark reality that we serve people is a very important thing in this day and age.
One of the comments, I'm just going to make a quick comment about this. One of the comments of this thread is, the reason I'm investing in them is because of their ibogaine derivative, which has shown it could potentially treat drug addiction. Is that part of your lineup? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that commenter is focused on 18MC, which is our ibogaine derivative that we're looking to deal with both opioid addiction and withdrawal, and ultimately maybe one day looking at that and other forms of addiction. Look, I just watched, I believe the documentary on HBO. It's the greatest crime of the century, I believe is what it's called. And it really documents out in great detail how the opioid crisis came about in America. It also now goes into stage 2 of the opioid crisis, which is fentanyl. And the amount of deaths that related to fentanyl have increased, I believe, in 2020 by 55%. And up until September 2020, we had 90,000 overdoses from opioids over a 12-month period. These problems are not getting better in the midst of COVID-19, right? These are real, serious problems to society that are costing us lots and lots of money. And it's not just, about solving that one specific issue with the opioid crisis. There is a broader problem around mental illness and addiction, and that is MindMed's mission. And we are the little engine that could. And now we're sitting on the NASDAQ. This is serious business.
Let's talk about the broader landscape of mental health now. Tying it back to one more comment here. You've got a lot of these comments rooting for your stock.
You love those comments.
I love going through what they're talking about. Some of them are just trolls. The trolls are always the funniest, but I'm picking up some of these positive comments right now. Psychedelics cured my panic disorder. This medicine is real. Been in since 32 cents. The company is amazing. Let's take it to the moon. Panic disorder. So people are suffering from real illnesses in the real world. Tell us about that. June 2020, McKinsey, I think it was McKinsey released a stat. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was one of the consulting companies. 11% of Americans surveyed wanted to commit suicide or had suicidal tendencies. Now that was almost a year ago. The economy has recovered a little bit since. Things have opened up. The unemployment rate has gone down. So one would assume that the rates of depression would have come down as a result. What do you think? Have you observed that at all?
I haven't seen any data that says that we're turning the curve here at all. And I think one of the interesting things about, unlike how like a vaccine, for example, can decrease the rate of a virus like COVID-19, mental health is a little bit different. It lingers and it builds up over time. And so while we might have seen those rates, I think those come from last summer. I think the CDC will probably release something new this summer. That doesn't mean it's going to be getting better, right? Like these things will compound over time. And that is why we need to work really, really hard over the next couple of years on clinical trials that are going to create really breakthrough interventional solutions to mental health. Because quite frankly, we don't have any, and we haven't had breakthroughs in decades on mental illness. And so that motivates me more now than ever.
And why do you think that currently there's still a stigma around psychedelics, LSD, and just drug use, whether it be for recreational purposes or for medicinal use? What don't people understand? What can you, if you could just give one message out to those doubters watching right now, what would that message be?
Well, I think one of the major issues with psychedelics is they have a history, right? And that history, a lot of the folks weren't even necessarily around for the history, but it's been ingrained into our conscious selves of that these are bad substances for you. And quite frankly, a lot of the scientific data that is coming out now is telling us otherwise. And so I think we need to give psychedelics another chance. And I think psychedelics probably have a 3 to 4 year window for that second chance to prove that we can actually solve for mental illness and addiction and other afflictions. And if you just look recently at the MAPS data around PTSD, very compelling data coming out of a phase 3 trial at the FDA in PTSD patients. The science is proving that this is, these things work. And so we're going to continue working on that as a company, and our entire industry is going to continue working on that. But stigma still exists, and stigma is the biggest threat to what we're working on. And that's part of the reason we're actually now partnering with Deepak Chopra, who's probably one of the leaders in alternative medicine in the United States, to talk about psychedelics and provide a new light for them. His mission at this point in his career and his journey is he would like to see all solutions that can solve for human healing, and psychedelics are just one tool in that tool set. And I think it's very important that we destigmatize them.
So tell us a little bit more about Deepak Chopra and his work for those of us who may not be familiar with what he did, and why it is that you partnered with him.
Well, I think Deepak Chopra is probably one of the pioneers in alternative medicine and mind-body wellness, and really looking at integrative solutions to health. And I think there's a lot of merit in some of that. And what we're looking to do is ultimately destigmatize these alternative medicines and bring them into the mainstream. And I think Deepak's following will really sort of resonate and understand this. And so it was an honor to be asked by the Chopra Foundation to work with them to help destigmatize psychedelic medicines. And one of I think the key things with psychedelics and many times a misunderstanding is that these are catalysts. They are not panaceas, right? They are catalysts for your mental health. And in many ways, they're a reset. They sort of take you out of your normal life and allow you to chart a new path. And that, there is the actual psychedelic assisted therapy session, and then there's the integration afterwards. And the integration period in many ways can be as powerful as the actual psychedelic assisted therapy session. And it really seeks change, I think, is the one main thing that comes out of these psychedelic experiences. But you have to have a willingness to want to evolve. as a person. And that ultimately is what I believe that psychedelic assisted therapy is going to help folks that are suffering from anxiety, depression, and addiction. That willingness to evolve, to not accept the status quo of your condition, but to find new ways to be healthy. And that's going to mean a little bit of change in how you go about mental wellness and your diet and all of these things. Integrative medicine, I think, will be in many ways the future of health. So that is part of the reason we are working with Dr. Chopra.
So Deepak has a huge fan following all over the world, millions of people who follow his work from the alternative medicine space. But outside of that space, doctors and scientists alike have criticized alternative medicines as being some sort of pseudoscience. Now, you're trying to legitimize your company by being a real company based on scientific facts and studies. So how would you respond to this kind of criticism?
Well, that's the beauty of science. It's a very democratic process. There's arguments and counter arguments, and there's peer reviews, and that's a good thing. And that's ultimately how science progresses. If you look at it over the history of time, there are going to be critics of Deepak. There are going to be critics of MindMed. There's going to be critics of solutions to the current opioid crisis and things that have caused it. What I think is really important is to focus on rigor and science. And that is why we've chosen the FDA pathway. And it was a prerequisite for us forming a partnership with the Chopra Foundation. They actually asked us, we don't believe in the legalization of psychedelics. We believe in them as medicines. And we think the FDA pathway is a clear way to get there. And so that was, I think, very powerful for me that, look, these are one tool in a tool set that can help address mental health and overall addiction. So we need to focus on that process in science, because that is how our society understands how medicines come to market, and that is how our government approves them. And so we will continue on our path, and we will not stray from that as part of our principles as regulated medicines.
Mm-hmm. I have spoken to Kevin O'Leary, who was one of your earlier investors, and he told me a story. He met you, I think, over lunch, and he said, like, I'm only going to invest in your company, JR, if you promise you will not make recreational drugs. He said, just look me in the eye and promise me you won't do that, and I'll invest. So I think first of all, was that really the way it happened? And, yeah.
Very accurate statement. We continue to hold that as part of our principles. And that's also a principle of Deepak Chopra. I mean, he one of the first things he asked me was, how are you proposing to bring psychedelics into society as medicines? Because these are very, very powerful substances, and if not controlled properly, they can cause issues as well. And I explained to him the FDA process. He's a medical doctor, right? Right. And so he said, that is the way, that is the path, and I will support you in your path because you're pursuing the FDA process.
I would like to ask you about the FDA process. Not everybody is familiar with how it works. I think it's important for investors to understand the timeline and sort of the what you have to submit in terms of data. Basically, the things you have to go through, the things that a biotech company have to do in order to gain approval. Can you walk us through just from a 30,000 feet overview of how this FDA approval process works?
Well, the FDA process can be long and strenuous, and for good reason, right? I mean, you're putting new substances into the human body. What's interesting about psychedelics is that these substances, at least the classic psychedelics like LSD and MDMA and psilocybin, have been in millions of people before, right? So in many ways, I don't think we can say it de-risks the proposition, but it certainly gives us comfort going into some of these studies that, we're not going to necessarily have toxicology issues that like a novel chemical entity that's never been in a human may have. But the process is long, right? If you started with a novel psychedelic, and there's a lot of little companies out there that are listed companies that are pursuing these novels and don't have a classics strategy like us. The novels, like when you're talking about discovering a new psychedelic and moving it all the way to a phase 3, I mean, that could be 10 to 12 years away. Our timeline looks like maybe a 3 to 4 year process to move something from a late phase 2 trial into a phase 3. And so that's, I think a key differentiating factor when you evaluate a company and look at it, because that 10 to 12 year horizon is going to be really, really tough to make a long-term sustainable company out of it. And that's, the drug trials, these FDA clinical trials are literally just half the battle here. We are, psychedelic assisted therapy is a totally new paradigm in mental health. It's going to require new infrastructure to be built in order to deliver our drugs. And so we are going to have to create technology platforms and amalgamate therapists and psychiatrists to help us deliver these drugs over time. And that's another key component of the battle that we're up against, and something that MindMed is really focusing on.
So let's talk a little bit about new developments for your company specifically, and then we can get into M&A in the space overall. Project Angie is something you're working on. We know about Project Lucy. What's Angie about?
Well, Angie is our newest project that we're working on, and it's addressing the pain market. Our Project Layla is looking at opioid addiction and withdrawal and sort of the overall addiction markets. But we also have to take a step back and realize, how did we get here? How did we get to the opioid crisis, right? It's because people are in pain, right? And that is why they ultimately showed up at doctors' offices and got prescriptions for Oxycontin and other derivatives of opioids like fentanyl. So there is an underlying problem. And what we found in some earlier research from the 1950s around LSD was that there was indications that these could be great solutions for treating pain. And so our new chief medical officer, Dr. Dan Carlin, has really been championing this and said, look, we need to look at LSD and other psychedelic substances in the treatment of pain. And so we're going to be looking at really two programs, one in a chronic pain syndrome and another in an undisclosed pain syndrome. But ultimately, what we're going to do is bring this through the FDA pathway, just like every other project that we work on. And so we're going to be heading into some pre-IND discussions with the FDA and looking at how do we use LSD to treat pain. And it's a really, really big market, David. This is, pain analgesics are a $31 billion a year business, right? And they're not, they definitely solve for pain, but they have a lot of after effects that are plaguing society. It's estimated that the opioid crisis in the United States can cost us $500 billion a year. Mm-hmm. I think if we can create a new treatment paradigm in pain, we have a really, really big business there. And so we're going to push forward with those clinical trials.
Okay, for a final question, you recently acquired Health Mode. What's next? Are you looking into more acquisitions? Do you think there will be more acquisitions in the space overall for biotech and pharmaceuticals and LSD companies like yourself?
I think Health Mode was a very timely acquisition for us. We needed a technology team that could help us build out these platforms that is ultimately going to launch and help us deploy psychedelic medicines across the country if we're able to achieve an approval at the FDA. And so the team's hard at work at building out various applications and some supporting infrastructure for our clinical trials. So I think it was a huge move for us, and I believe that MindMed is going to become as much a technology company as it is a drug development company, and that's a key differentiator in this little psychedelic biotech space that we're in. I think M&A overall, there's as I mentioned to you before, there's a clear leadership pack forming of companies that are going to be listed on NASDAQ, right? I think that is where the capital is ultimately going to flow to at scale. And the process to get an FDA approval is not cheap. And in order to scale these medicines, it's not going to be cheap. And so I think there's going to be a few players in the space, leaders. I don't necessarily see that some of these smaller players totally working out. But I think it's going to be an interesting opportunity for the leaders, to look at potentially buying some of these companies in the future. right now, we're not entirely seeing some of the value in the things that have been presented to us, and we're gonna work on acquisitions, but we're gonna work on the right acquisitions that ultimately build us shareholder value and not some type of hype factor.
Right. All right. Well, fantastic update as always. I look forward to speaking with you again on your next phase of company developments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin.